A photographer's firsthand account of what he calls the real story of the George Floyd riots, his never-before-seen photos, and the reason why he's finally speaking out. Next. Chris Burt is my guest. In 2020, you took photos during the riots in Minneapolis. I know you're a resident in Minneapolis then. Good to see you, sir. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for having me.
You have a long resume, I know, in photography, Chris, and have captured what I know you call some tension spots all around the world. That certainly arrived in your own backyard. But take us back to May of 2020, and why'd you go out to capture that dangerous time in the first place?
So it's true. I did grow up around the world, and one of the formative experiences when I was a little kid, my dad worked for a 3M company, and we lived in Europe in the early 70s when I was in, elementary school, and the Red Brigades were capturing kids of the foreign nationals, and it was terrorism. It was very tense, and that kind of tension around when I sense there's some kind of electric danger in the air, I have a sense that I need to go see what's really going on. And in this particular instance, I recall very, very succinctly that I was watching television and I heard that somebody had broken the windows on the police precinct. And I knew, that's it. I mean, that's the beginning of anarchy, if you will, when they start busting up a police station. And so by Tuesday morning or Tuesday afternoon, it was clear something was wrong. And I was working at the time, I was working over in Seven Corners, and I told my staff, I said, hey, you're not going to see me for 7 days or for however long this happens. I'm just going to go out and start shooting, literally taking pictures of what's going on. Because I had a sense that nothing was also being done about it. And as we can see in retrospect, that's exactly what happened.
It sounds like a few things stood out to you right away, despite all of the chaos. What was that? What was that stood out to you?
They did. In fact, there were very quickly, I realized I was struck by three elements. And the first element was the language. I wanted to capture the language. Marshall McLuhan, people probably don't remember who he was, but he was a famous Canadian media theorist. And he said that that graffiti are the hieroglyphs of our time, right? So they kind of tell the story. The graffiti tells the story of what's going on. And the graffiti was absolutely violent. It wasn't, peaceful or even protest graffiti. It was, I want to have cops killed. Kill cops. F the boys in blue. We're coming for you. There will be no excuse for the terror once we come for you. There were also hieroglyphs or graffiti, which were the signatures of anarchist groups. And one of the signatures of anarchist groups internationally is something called ACAB, ACAB, which stands for All Caps Are. I don't know if I could say it on the podcast, but are bastards. Sorry, that's what it means. And also they use the term 1312. And lastly, Antifa has as an A that they represent, that they kind of use as their signature once they've, done their whatever they do. And that was all over the place. The graffiti was just by Tuesday PM, that graffiti was all over the place. And so as I moved around the city, I wanted to capture the language of violence. And it clearly was the language of not just violence, but the language of anarchy, the language of, we are coming for you, we want to kill you, and we won't rest until a new society is brought into being. And I think one of my photographs captures that. Some of the graffiti was spray painted on the side of the Target headquarters. The second thing that struck me was the scale of the destruction. Now, that became apparent to me as the riots continued. By Wednesday evening, when they literally abandoned the police precinct, and the story about why they had to abandon it is completely bogus. That was the white flag that they threw up that invited the violence. That I want to make clear, everybody understands the scope of the violence in 3 days. The scope of the violence was $500 million in damage to buildings. 893 buildings were damaged or destroyed in 3 days. And the scale of that destruction was something that, if you look at my pictures capture how it's concrete and steel that are twisted and bent. And there's like a 3 to 5 story warehouse building that was not only burned to the ground, but just decimated. And to be able to accomplish that level of burning something down, you need to have professionals involved in that. And it was very clear to me that professional arsonists had engaged in this destruction. I know one of the stories that came out was they imported some right-wing guy from Wisconsin and he threw a match in the auto zone, right? Okay, yeah. You compare that to 893 buildings. You compare that to, I go back to when I was in Europe as a little kid, you could still see the bombed out buildings in Germany. That's what Minneapolis looked like. Minneapolis looked like a war zone. And the last thing that I wanted to capture was I wanted to capture the people. And I wanted to capture the disconnect between what the people were feeling and how they were reacting to this and what the leaders were doing. The leaders completely absconded in all of their responsibilities. There was no leadership for almost 5 days, if not more. They bailed when it burned. They bailed when it burned. They bailed the minute the Minneapolis police headquarters had a rock thrown in it. And then when they started to burn the city down, it was 3 more days, I think, before the governor actually called out the real National Guard. And what was sad was, you see some pictures that I captured of the National Guard, of the state police. And there are pictures where the protesters have like a bullhorn, and they're right next to the state patrol person who's standing there stoically, holding their ground, while a bullhorn is in their ear, right in their face. And they were stoic. They were cool under pressure as that happened. And just to be, fair-minded and broad-minded about this, I later went to where George Floyd's brother came to 38th and the 38th and Chicago. And a pastor from, I think it was Louisiana, don't quote me on that, but they had bussed him in to show him at his brother's shrine that had been put forth. And it was interesting because I bumped directly into George Floyd's brother as he was walking. And then I bumped into the pastor. He said something like, "This has got to stop." And I asked him, and I said, "I agree. What do you mean?" He goes, "We have to live. We have to find peace out of this." And there was a desire, I think, no matter what side of the aisle, if you want to put it that way, people were on. I don't think that the people that wanted to protest this, I don't think they had hate in their hearts. I mean, I think that they were angry, but I think that, and I think they want things to change. But I think they're also following something that they don't fully understand. They don't understand totalitarian violence. And this is what was happening. It was premeditated, planned, calculated, totalitarian violence. And it was designed to destroy the system. And that, if my pictures don't show that, then, that's what I tried to show. And I did try to bring in some pictures of people that, some of the people that were all sides engaged in this. 2 more pictures that stand out there's a picture of a young woman who I had briefly asked her a question. I wasn't able to talk to her too much, but young blonde woman. And she had kind of come over from the University of Minnesota to take part in the protest. And you see her face, she got to the protest and she realized there was tension. I mean, there was screaming. I kind of got my camera right in between the police and the protesters. And it was like if somebody threw a match, something was going to happen again. And you could see on her face, she's like, is this really what this is about? This isn't what I was sold. This is what my friends are talking about. Some of the people on college campuses are trying to, I don't know what they said, Coachella for protest sometimes. It's kind of I don't know. The thing is, real violence, real anarchy has that kind of tension to it, that powder keg to it. And she had that, she got there and she saw that. And suddenly she was like, wow, I don't know. This isn't what I've been told. This isn't what I've been sold. And the other picture is, there's a photograph again that took place when George Floyd's brother was at 38th in Chicago. And there was a rap group. It's a picture of rappers. My son knew who they were. They're well-known rappers. It wasn't Atmosphere, but it was a group. And they had brought food for the event. And they were trying to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So that's a law. I mean, you asked me, what did you want? You asked me, what did you want me? What did I want to represent? And that's exactly what I wanted to represent.
And I think your pictures do exactly that. And then it has to surprise you a bit how this rioting, this chaos is playing out right in front of you. You're there. Corporate media in Minneapolis, even to this day, seems to still sell the idea that this was just a peaceful protest. Does that reflect the realities that you photographed and saw for yourself? And what do you make of the local media's message?
Well, I have to say, this is very interesting. When the event first took place, it was, the local media. So when I was watching it on television, and I think I sent you a booklet that showed, I captured some screens from the news just to kind of give you some sense for how here's Mayor Fry, the 33-year-old mayor of Minneapolis. And, he was an Instagram star, 2 or 3 weeks before, and suddenly he's got this problem on his hands. And the city council, is singing "We Shall Overcome" while they decide to abandon the police precinct. I thought that when they were first covering it, there was no real bias because they were just trying to cover what was happening. But where I realized something was wrong was when it was 31st Street in Minneapolis, right? They started lighting dumpster fires on the street in 31st in Minneapolis. And I have pictures of the bank that burned, right? I have pictures of the bank that burned at the end of 31st. But they were lighting dumpster fires right next to apartment buildings where kids were living. I know because I lived on that street for 6 years. And those flames were going higher and higher, and they were throwing more and more accelerant on those dumpsters. And that was the footage that an anchor person or a stringer from CNN said on the screen, mostly peaceful protests. That says it all. These were not peaceful protests. I may have taken more pictures than anybody outside of a newspaper of what happened. And I can assure you, these were violent. We want society to change, or we're coming for you. It was not peaceful. And so you asked me about the local media coverage, recently. Well, I have to say, I looked at USA Today yesterday, and there was an article written about how the current VP candidate, our Governor Walz, there's a hagiography, if you will, about, well, he tried what he could and this and that. You can't spin it. I think what they're trying to do is they have not shown the language. They have not shown the language. Okay, so they have not shown that. And the thing is, this is a story that you have to have on your story, on your video. You have to have this might be sensitive viewing for somebody. which I kind of hesitate to say, why did they put that on there? Because this is really what happened. That was the story. The language needed to be shown. It has not been shown in any picture I saw. And the problem that I have additionally is, so with the local news again, you could show the AutoZone burning up, right? But that looks like the chop zone in Seattle, or that looks like what they were doing to, the federal buildings in Portland. They didn't burn down they didn't burn down businesses, and they didn't burn down, massive warehouses in Portland. They didn't have industrial scale violence in Portland. They had a bunch of crazies that went into Seattle, but the mayor there, when it first happened, she said, well, it's just the summer of love, right? That's literally what was being said. And so my point, the first thing is, I don't think they've captured the language. Secondly, clearly no pictures captured the scale. And if any picture comes out of this, I want people to see the way those buildings were burned. That's what I want to show. Because when you see that, there's no difference between Beirut, which used to be a beautiful city in the 70s, and Beirut today. That's what happens when anarchy comes to town. And they have to be able to show both of those things, or nobody is doing justice to the story of what happened in Minneapolis.
And that story of what happened is, you're right, in the news again with Governor Walz becoming a candidate for vice president. What would you say? What would your message to voters be at this point, Chris, after living this and even reflecting on, moving out of Minneapolis and having a business there for decades? How has it changed?
I can think of two words. I'm going to repeat them again. Burn and bail. Minneapolis burned, and it burned. It wasn't just protest. It was anarchy. They wanted to burn down the old order. 893 businesses burned to the ground. Had Walz called in the National Guard on Wednesday, had they not abandoned the police precinct on Wednesday evening, and if they called in the National Guard even on Friday, they would have avoided close to hundreds of millions of dollars in damages. And secondly, if somebody professes to be for the people, do you know that out of that $500 million worth of property damage to the Twin Cities alone, 60% of those buildings were uninsured? Because where did the violence fall? It fell exactly where it always falls, on the poor, on those who can least afford to have this happen to them. They were the ones that were destroyed by this. And the local government, Walz in particular, not only did he do nothing, as it burned, he bailed. He bailed and he bailed and he bailed. And that seems to be a leitmotif of the way he's handled things since he's been in office. This wasn't the first time he bailed on somebody. And the last thing that I wanted to say is, you know who else bailed? Apparently Kamala Harris set up a fund to bail out the arsonists and some of those that were involved in the burning in Minneapolis. Now, I understand. I have friends, I have friends on all sides of the political story here. But I think that America has an issue with the kind of violence that happens in other parts of the world. That's my story. I grew up in different parts of the world where there has been violence, where there's been war, where there's been destruction of society. And the ugly face of that is something that we are so insulated from, that we are able to engage in a politics where people can talk about, revolution in the abstract. But once they see it up front and personal, they bail, they run. We can't solve this problem unless we're willing to actually confront it for what it is. And I'm not here to say how somebody should vote, how somebody should fix an issue in society, but I am here to say, please, as an American, go out and see what it looks like. Because if you can't see this for yourself, you will never be able to do something about it. for other people. I feel like I'm preaching or something.
I think it's a message people need to hear, Chris. I hope people will share your pictures and share this conversation. Someone who lived through it, and it's sad to see, I think, what Minneapolis has turned into and how it has transformed. And that's something I know that you wanted to get the message out about as well, because I think in many cases people have forgotten. So it's so important to go ahead and remind them.
They have. They're insulated from it, and I wanted to say that sadly, Minneapolis is yet to recover from this. If you, and again, I don't work downtown anymore, but if you go downtown, downtown Minneapolis is more or less a ghost town between where the basketball games happen, where the football games happen. Okay, and it's been that way for, like I say, almost 4 years. And at the time this happened, the people that I was working with, they knew some of the people in city government, and the then police chief had come and talked to us, not about this, but about something else. And, they were, I could tell that they're not, what needed to happen. And the last thing I'll say is what needed to happen is we needed to have that kind of George Bush moment when he got down to 9/11 and he had that microphone and that bullhorn and he stood up and he talked to America. Why didn't we have that moment in Minnesota? Why don't we have that moment nationally? Why are the leaders afraid to stay in the breach of violence and say something about it? It's just too comfortable to handle it another way.
I wish I had those answers for you, but Chris Burt, want to thank you so much for joining me. Your voice in all of this is critical.
Thanks so much, Liz.
That'll do it for this episode of Liz Collin Reports. We'll see you next time.